One of the challenges in being a survivor of childhood trauma is acknowledging it for the significant thing that it is, the experience and what it creates. On the flip side of that is the idea that people who experience childhood trauma then naturally have any number of mental health diagnoses. There are extremes on both sides, and I don't think either one of them are necessarily helpful. And there is a question that I've seen about whether or not childhood trauma is a mental illness, and that's what I want to get into today. Welcome, I'm Peggy Oliveira. Thanks so much for joining me. So for anybody who has watched my videos or listened to me speak before, you probably know what my response is going to be to this. But I want to kind of expand on it a little bit and maybe even help us conceptualize it a little bit differently. So obviously, again, if you followed me, there is no doubt that childhood trauma has a significant impact on every aspect of our lives. How we think, how we feel, how we respond, both consciously and not. There is no way to escape the impact of childhood trauma, particularly what I tend to speak about the most is childhood sexual trauma. However, does that impact equate to mental illness? Is it, in fact, a mental illness? And I think one kind of easy way to look at that is, would we ever consider being a combat veteran or being in a war a mental illness? Would we consider being in a bad car accident a mental illness? Or in a natural disaster mental illness? Well, my guess is you're probably thinking, well, no. However, when it comes to more interpersonal things, I think it's a little bit easier for people to kind of connect those two things. For example, another question you could ask is, if somebody is in an abusive relationship, is that a mental illness? And the answer is still no, but I think some people might argue that, well, anybody who would stay in an abusive relationship, obviously there's something going on there. And while that may be true, that there's any number of reasons, lots of different reasons why somebody would stay in an abusive relationship, it doesn't mean that they're mentally ill. And while there is a lot more awareness around mental health and mental illness, which is great, so important, I think like a lot of things, we've kind of swung to the far end of the idea of mental illness that isn't necessarily ideal either. So while childhood trauma is not a mental illness, it is in fact an experience, just like a natural disaster or an abusive relationship. It's an experience that creates long-term impact. So that can look a lot of different ways, right? Like I talk all the time about our sense of self, our worthiness, our sense of being deserving of good things, what we anticipate or expect in relationships, what we're willing to kind of tolerate because we believe that that's what we deserve. Certainly feeling depressed or anxious, whether it's clinically or not. Lots of fears, even lots of triggers, potentially even PTSD or more likely CPTSD. Like there's a lot of things that go along with that. And there certainly can be a very real diagnosis that somebody may have, like clinical depression or clinical anxiety or PTSD. CPSD isn't technically a disorder at this particular time, though it should be. So while it is not a mental illness, And I think it's important to recognize that because you've experienced childhood trauma, it does not mean you automatically have a mental illness. It does mean, without a doubt, that you are wounded and you are impacted by that. There's no escaping that, unfortunately. There's a lot of factors that go into how deeply you are affected by it, but you can't escape it. So recognizing that it's not a mental illness and you are not doomed to experience all of these things that are associated with mental illness or childhood trauma specifically, I think is really important. Also being able to recognize that we are all impacted when we experience childhood trauma, and being able to recognize, what does that look like for me in my life? Because there are different ways that we are affected. While we might struggle with the underlying similar or same issues, like sense of self, unworthiness, and that sort of thing, fear within relationships or trust, how that presents itself may look a little bit different. And I think an example, kind of a clear example of this, is for some people, they become very potentially like perfectionistic or very independent, very successful in quotes, because what does that really mean? But the idea of what our society says is successful, right? So there are people that can go that direction because they're trying to control everything and make everything perfect so that nothing bad happens. Other people tend to go kind of in an opposite direction and don't follow through on things because they don't believe in themselves and they think it doesn't really matter. And that's where their thought process goes. For the other people, it's, if I just do this well enough, everything will be okay. Some version of that. The words may be a little bit different. On the other side, nothing is ever going to be okay. I have no control over anything. I'm powerless. And one isn't better than the other. One isn't stronger than the other. And I think that's important to recognize. Society perceives this one, the one of perfectionistic and independent, as strong, and the other one being weak. It's really not. It's just a lot of factors that go into it that determine which direction we tend to go. And we may have a little bit of both, depending on the time in our life or the circumstances with different types of scenarios. So there can be some differences there. But either one can have a mental health aspect to it, maybe even particularly a diagnosis that could be rightfully diagnosed. And I say rightfully because I think a lot of people are way overdiagnosed. I think misdiagnosed, especially when there is an acknowledgement of childhood trauma. But certainly on the spectrum of anxiety or depression, a lot of people find themselves there. But it's important to recognize that people that don't have histories of childhood trauma often find themselves there. And on that spectrum, it could be relatively mild, only occasionally. And for other people, it might be extreme, where you're suicidal, can't get out of bed, or can't leave your house. You never feel a sense of peace or ease. Maybe you have panic attacks. And of course, anywhere in between there. And I do think it's important to be conscious of how we are labeling the impact of that trauma. Again, you will be impacted in pretty significant ways, but that doesn't necessarily mean that you are mentally ill. And again, I'm putting that in quotes because that can create a lot of challenges for people. It can create the idea of feeling powerless to do anything about it, to be able to change anything. Mental illness is real, but having a normal reaction including being on that spectrum of depression or anxiety and unhealthy coping mechanisms, those are normal responses to a traumatic experience, to deep wounding that never gets the attention that it needs, the healing that it needs. That's a normal reaction to that. Now, is that a mental illness? Some people would say yes, especially if there's a clinical diagnosis that makes sense. But for me, I actually argue that it's not a mental illness. It's a normal reaction, kind of like grief is a normal reaction to losing somebody that you love deeply, right? And grief is not a mental illness. It's not diagnosed as a mental illness. Prolonged grief, complicated grief can have a diagnosis attached after a certain period of time, and there's other criteria that have to be matched or met. But grief is a really significant thing that can affect people in pretty significant ways for quite a long period of time, right? And there's all kinds of stages. Some days you're doing well, some days you're not. But does that make it a mental illness? Absolutely not. It's a normal reaction to grief, to loss, to all the things associated with what that loss means. And the same is true for childhood trauma. And what I want you to take from this is, one, being compassionate with yourself for the struggles that you have, and recognizing that struggling in myriad ways is normal, that we all struggle in various ways when we have experienced that, particularly if we have denied it, never addressed it. The more that we do that, the longer we have that impact, and sometimes the more impacted we are by it. So meet your struggle, whatever that struggle looks like, with compassion. While it may be hard to believe that you can heal, try to allow yourself to take in that while that struggle maybe has been with you as long as you can possibly remember, it doesn't mean that that is all that is possible for your life. I have worked with survivors that run the entire spectrum of childhood trauma. And while everybody's experience obviously is a little bit different and their struggles may look a little bit different, there is much more that is very, very similar. And wherever somebody may fall on that spectrum, there is healing that happens. It does. And I think part of the challenge is thinking about, what does it really mean to heal? And I will do another video about that, because I think it's important that we as individuals and as society recognize, what does that really mean? But it is possible. So thanks so much for watching. I'd love to hear from you. One of the things that happens so often is people are diagnosed with all kinds of things that are not accurate, and then they're put on medications, and that can create a lot of challenges as well. So sometimes the diagnosis might be very accurate and important, but sometimes it's not an accurate diagnosis at all. And can, there's the idea of we live up to those expectations. And so a lot of times when people are diagnosed, because they feel that sense of powerlessness, they kind of give up on the idea of being able to really feel differently, to experience things differently. So if that is you, if you have kind of given up, please don't. Whether it's an accurate diagnosis or not, there are likely some things that you can do to feel better. Even if whatever that diagnosis might be may make it really difficult for you to get to the place that you ultimately want to be, there is progress along the way that makes a huge difference. So please don't give up. Thanks for watching. Share in the comments below anything that you'd like to share. If you haven't yet, make sure to subscribe, click the bell for notifications. I'll look forward to seeing you next time.